In this video, we're going to look at inequations. Now, we solve inequations the same way we solve equations, by adding and subtracting to both sides, by multiplying both sides, by dividing both sides. Whatever I do to one side of an inequation, I need to do the same to the other side. There is one difference when we're dealing with inequations, and that is if at any stage I divide through or multiply through by a negative, then I must switch the direction of the inequality, and this is this symbol here we're talking about. Just to illustrate that before we go on, think about an inequality we know to be true. So I know that, let's see, the number 6 is greater than the number 4. Now, if I was to multiply or divide both sides here by a positive number, so let's say let's divide both sides by 2, which is a positive number, then we end up with 6 divided by 2 is 3, and 4 divided by 2 is 2, and the inequality stays the same. Now that's still true, because I'm dividing through by a positive number, I don't need to do anything with this. Let's take the same example now, and we'll look at 6 greater than 4, but this time we're going to divide through by a negative number, so we're going to divide through by negative 2 and divide by negative 2. Now what happens then when we do 6 divided by negative 2? We end up with negative 3, and when I do 4 divided by negative 2, I end up with negative 2. But if I put the inequality in the same way, you can see that this statement is no longer true, because we know on our number line that negative 3 isn't actually greater than negative 2. Negative 3 is less than. So because I've divided here and here by a negative, I need to flip this inequality the other way around. So I'm going to rub that out. And because I've divided by a negative, I'm going to flip the direction of the inequality. So it was pointing that way, and now it's pointing this way. And that is now true. Negative 3 is less than negative 2. So basically, anytime you divide through by a negative, you must flip the inequality. So we'll get rid of that, and we'll have a look at this first example. Now, this tends to be the very last stage in a question. Just like the last stage of solving an equation, you usually have something like, I don't know, 5x equals 20, and you divide both sides by 5. If you end up with a negative number here in front of the x, you are dividing by negative 3, and you are dividing by negative 3. That means I'm dividing by a negative, so that is going to give me x. Negative 3 divided by negative 3 is positive 1. And 9 divided by negative 3 is negative 3. And because I've divided by a negative, the inequality was in this direction. I'm going to flip it to that direction. And that's the main difference we need to know. So in these two questions, what we're going to do is we're going to work through them, and we're going to look out for that idea of flipping an inequality. Remember, we only do that if we are dividing or multiplying by a negative number, not just if there's a negative number involved somewhere. So let's start off with the first question. We will multiply out the brackets. So that's going to give us 4x plus 8 is greater than 24. We can then just solve like a normal equation. So we're going to take away 8. So 4x is now greater than 16. And we can then divide by 4 and divide by 4. So x is greater than 4. Now, a couple of things you need to look out for when you're doing an inequality. The common mistake that most people make is at some point, this inequality, as it goes down, changes into an equal sign, because people forget they're doing an equation. And it's so like solving an equation, we're so used to putting equals in the middle there. You'll also notice that here, when I divided at that last part, I was dividing by positive 4. So dividing by a positive, I don't do anything to the inequality. It stays pointing in the same direction. So that question is quite straightforward. Let's have a look at the next question here. 3 multiplied by x is 3x. 3 multiplied by 6 is positive 18. And that is less than or equal to 6x. And then I might start to solve that. Now, there's different ways I can approach this, and we'll have a look at both of them in a minute. But let's start off by saying, well, I don't want to have any x's on this side of my inequality. So I'm going to subtract 6x and subtract 6x. That's going to give me negative 3x plus 18 is less than or equal to 0. I'm then going to subtract 18 from both sides to get rid of this. So I'm going to be left with negative 3x is less than or equal to negative 18. And then to get the x on its own, I'm going to have to divide by what's multiplying it. So divide both sides by negative 3. And divide again by negative 3. And that is going to give me x. And if I look over here, negative 18 divided by negative 3. Well, first of all, negative divided by negative is positive. And 18 divided by 3 is 6. So I end up with positive 6. Now, because I have divided by a negative number, I must flip the direction of the inequality. So that is greater than or equal to 6. Now, There is another way of dealing with that question at an earlier stage. So if I go back up to this stage here, and I'm going to rewrite this in a different colour down at the bottom and see what I could have done differently, 3x plus 18 is greater than or, less than or equal to 6x. Because I've got more x's over here than I do over here, what I might be tempted to do is actually just swap the sides around. Obviously, because this is an inequality, if I swap the 6x over to this side and I swap the 3x plus 18 over to this side, then I'm going to have to swap the inequality symbol as well. So 6x, 3x plus 18, swap them around, and because I've swapped them around, swap the direction of the inequality around as well. And then I can solve by subtracting 3x from both sides, 3x less than or equal to 18, and lastly, I'm now left in a situation where I'm actually dividing by a positive number, so I don't need to flip the inequality anymore. So divide both sides by 3, and I get x greater than or equal to 6. So at some point you have to flip the inequality in this question. It just depends whether you want to do it earlier to avoid having to divide by a negative like we did here, or if you're quite happy just to deal with negatives, and then when I divide by a negative, remember to flip the inequality.